In the brutal winter of 1897, on the frozen artery of the Chilkoot Pass, two types of shelter defined the landscape of human desperation. The first was the conventional, canvas tents strained to bursting by the wind, and crude huts made of sawn lake ice, their walls radiating a mortal chill. Inside these, men of the Klondike Gold Rush shivered, burning through mountains of precious timber just to keep their blood moving. The second shelter was a statistical anomaly, a low mound of packed snow hardly visible on the landscape. Inside this mound, Scout Silas Reed sat comfortably, his small stove burning mere twigs, his shelter floor dry, while the ice hut struggled to stay 10 degrees Fahrenheit above the 30 degrees ambient temperature. Reed's simple snow cave consistently measured 43 degrees warmer. What did this one scout understand about the physics of snow that thousands of experienced miners and frontiersmen had completely missed? The year was 1897. The world had gone mad for Klondike gold. To reach the Yukon fields, stampeders had to haul a literal ton of goods, a requirement by the Northwest Mounted Police to prevent mass starvation over the treacherous mountain passes. The Chilkoot was a bottleneck of ice, wind, and ambition. The conventional wisdom for survival in this environment was written in the language of brute force. The manuals for Arctic exploration and the hard-won experience of miners from Colorado and California all pointed to one conclusion: the enemy was the wind. Therefore, the defense must be solid, heavy, and immovable. Men spent weeks sawing 18-inch blocks of clear blue ice from the frozen lakes. They stacked them like masonry, using a slush of snow and water as mortar, which instantly froze. They roofed this structure with heavy canvas or timbers, if they could be found. This was the ice shelter, a fortress against the gale. It was hard, it was stable, and it was considered the pinnacle of frontier engineering. Everyone trusted this logic. It was a visible, tangible defense. The alternative, a simple canvas tent, was known to be a death trap in a real storm, offering privacy but zero insulation, its interior temperature barely distinguishable from the outside. The choice seemed clear: build hard, build heavy, or die. Elias Thorne, a veteran of the Colorado silver mines, was a firm believer in conventional wisdom. He directed his small party with grim efficiency, dedicating 4 days to building their shelter near the shore of Lake Bennett. They used hand saws, chipping away at the 3-foot-thick ice, hauling the 100-pound blocks into position. Their resulting hut was a testament to labor, 10 feet by 12 feet, with walls 18 inches thick. They chinked the gaps with snow, which quickly melted from the stove's heat and refroze, sealing the structure. "She's solid as a bank vault," Thorne declared, his breath pluming. But the vault was a cold one. The problem was physics. Ice, while solid, is a terrible insulator. It is a highly effective conductor of heat. The moment they fired up their cast-iron stove, the ice walls began to act as a massive heat sink, pulling the warmth from the air and radiating it directly outside. The interior surface of the ice was a constant, weeping sheet of frost. With an outside temperature of 30 degrees, Thorne's stove, consuming nearly 50 pounds of scarce wood per day, could barely raise the internal temperature to 5 degrees. The men sleeping nearest the walls found their blankets frozen solid to the ice by morning. The air was thick with smoke, damp, and soul-crushingly cold. It was a fortress, yes, but they were freezing to death inside it. Silas Reed was not a miner. He was a former U.S. Army scout, a quiet man who had spent 15 years in the Dakota and Montana territories. He had learned his trade not from Army manuals, but from the men he was once assigned to track. His true education in winter survival had come during a disastrous patrol in the 1880s, where his detachment, following regulations, nearly froze. They were found by a small band of Cree hunters. A Cree elder, amused by the soldiers' predicament, had shown Reed the Simi, or snow lodge. The elder explained, through a translator, that hard blue ice was dead. It was just frozen water. The real blanket, he said, was the wind-packed snow. "This," the elder had said, grabbing a handful of hard drift, "is full of air. The air is the blanket. The snow just holds the air still. Reed learned to read snow not by its hardness, but by its texture, understanding that the interlocking crystals of sintered drift snow created millions of microscopic air pockets. This was insulation, the same principle as wool or fur. When he arrived at the Chilkoot and saw men building with ice, he shook his head. They were building their tombs. While Elias Thorne's crew sawed at the lake, Silas Reed walked away from the main camp, carrying a lightweight collapsible shovel and a small saw. He ignored the hard, blue ice. He sought out a deep wind-packed drift on the lee side of a granite ridge, snow that had been compressed and bonded by months of wind. He began not by building up, but by digging down. He excavated a 4-foot-deep trench, the cold trap. At the bottom of this trench, he began to dig horizontally, and then upwards into the drift, hollowing out a dome-shaped chamber approximately 8 feet in diameter. The walls were not blocks. They were the undisturbed, 3-foot-thick sintered snow of the drift itself. He built a small raised sleeping platform from packed snow, 18 inches high, placing it above the level of the entrance trench. The entire structure, from the outside, looked like nothing more than a slight disturbance in the drift, its entrance covered by a single canvas flap. Thorne, passing by, laughed. "That's a coyote den, Reed. The first real wind will collapse that powder." Reed said nothing. He just continued to carve a small 2-inch ventilation hole in the roof with his knife, trusting the physics he had learned years ago. The conflict at play was a fundamental disagreement on the nature of survival. Thorne and the conventionalists saw the world as a battle of mass. To them, the 30-degree-th wind was a physical force, an invading army. The only logical response was to build a fortress of equal or greater mass. Their engineering was about structural integrity, 18-inch ice walls to block the wind, a heavy stove to wage a war of brute force against the cold inside. This was a philosophy of confrontation. Silas Reed, conversely, saw the world through the lens of thermodynamics. The enemy was not the cold. The enemy was heat loss. His structure was not a fortress, it was a container. He understood that a human body, even at rest, is a 100-watt heater. The tiny stove was a supplement. The challenge was simply to keep that heat from escaping. His entire design was based on controlling the 3 forms of heat transfer. Conduction, eliminated by using thick, air-filled snow, an insulator, instead of solid ice, a conductor. Convection, controlled by the cold trap entrance, which prevented warm air from flowing out and cold air from flowing in. Radiation, minimized by the small enclosed space. It was a philosophy of efficiency. The proof arrived in the form of Sergeant Alistair Finch of the Northwest Mounted Police. Finch was a methodical, data-driven man, tasked with inspecting the camps for safety, provisions, and health. He carried a calibrated spirit thermometer on his jacket, and his logbook was already full of grim statistics on frostbite and scurvy. He first visited Thorne's ice hut, unwrapping his thermometer. The reading was stark. Outside temperature, 32 degrees Celsius. Inside Thorne's shelter, 1 foot from the wall, 8 degrees. In the center of the hut, where the stove roared, 8 degrees. A 40-degree gain, but at the cost of a roaring fire and a damp, miserable existence. Then, Finch visited the snow mound he had been told about. He had to crouch to enter, dropping down into the cold trap, and then stepping up into the main chamber. The air was immediately different. It was still, quiet, and felt neutral, not actively stealing his heat. Silas Reed was sitting on his sleeping bag, mending a harness by the light of a single candle. His tiny stove, made from a 5-gallon biscuit tin, was burning a handful of willow twigs, giving off a pale blue heat. Finch hung his thermometer. He waited 5 minutes. He checked his log. He wrote, "Reed shelter, ambient, 32 degrees Fahrenheit, interior temp, plus 33 degrees." It was a 65-degree difference, maintained by a candle and a few sticks. But the most important number was the one that became legend. The difference between Thorne's shelter, +8 degrees Fahrenheit, and Reed's, +33 degrees Fahrenheit, was significant, but the stable, livable temperature Reed maintained just above freezing, was consistently 43 degrees warmer than the average ice block shelters, which often dipped well below zero. The genius of Reed's design was its elegant simplicity, a system of layered defenses. The first layer was the material itself. Sintered snow, with its millions of trapped air pockets, has an insulating R value of approximately 1 to 2 per inch. Reed's 3-foot, 36-inch walls provided an R value of R36 to R72, comparable to a modern insulated house. Elias Thorne's 18-inch ice wall, by contrast, had an R value of roughly R1.5. Reed's wall was, in thermal terms, over 20 times more effective. The second layer was the design. The cold trap entrance ensured that any air movement was contained. Cold air, being dense, would flow into the trench and simply stay there, forming a pool of cold that blocked further drafts. The warm air from Reed's body, his candle and his tiny stove would rise and stay trapped in the upper dome. The raised sleeping platform ensured he slept above the cold pool, in the bubble of warmest air. The third layer was moisture and air management. The 2-inch ventilation hole at the apex was not an afterthought. It was critical. It allowed carbon dioxide and, crucially, water vapor from breath and cooking to escape. In Thorne's ice hut, this moisture froze on the walls, making the shelter a damp, icy cave. In Reed's, the snow walls breathed, allowing vapor to pass slowly through, keeping his sleeping bag and clothes dry. A dry man, Reed knew, was a warm man. In the last week of January 1898, the Great Blizzard hit the passes. It was a 3-day storm of apocalyptic force. The temperature plummeted to 55 degrees Fahrenheit, and winds gusted to over 60 miles per hour, creating a total whiteout. This was the ultimate test. The conventional structures failed catastrophically. Canvas tents were shredded, their occupants freezing in minutes. The ice shelters, like Thorne's, survived the wind, but became thermal tombs. The 60-mile-per-hour wind passing over the conductive ice walls acted like a radiator in reverse, sucking heat out at an impossible rate. Thorne's stove, even burning 24 hours a day, couldn't compete. The interior of his hut dropped to 20 degrees. To survive, his party had to stop the stove, to avoid carbon monoxide poisoning from a clogged chimney, and huddle together for body warmth, suffering agonizing frostbite. In stark contrast, Silas Reed experienced the storm as a muffled, distant howl. The blizzard added to his shelter, piling 4 feet of new snow on top, increasing his insulation. Inside, the temperature barely fluctuated. With the outside air at 55 degrees Fahrenheit, the interior of his snow cave held steady at 138 degrees Celsius. This was a 93-degree temperature differential, maintained by a structure made of nothing but snow. He had enough twigs to burn his small stove for an hour a day, allowing him to cook a warm meal and melt snow for water. He was not surviving. He was living. When the storm broke on the 4th day, Silas Reed had to dig up to get out. The landscape was a field of white humps, a graveyard of shredded canvas, and desperate failed structures. Reed, joined by Sergeant Finch, who had weathered the storm in a similar snow cave, began a grim search. They found Thorne's party. The ice hut was intact, but silent. Inside, the 3 men were alive, but barely. They were in the advanced stages of hypothermia, their skin gray, their extremities black with frostbite. Reed and Finch acted quickly. They moved the men, one by one, to Reed's snow cave. The shelter, designed for 1, now had to support 4. This introduced a new technical challenge, managing the exponential increase in moisture and carbon dioxide from 4 men. Reed immediately took his knife and widened the ventilation port to 4 inches. He and Finch established a strict protocol: no wet gear inside sleeping bags. All damp moccasins and mittens were hung from a line near the vent. The stove was managed not for heat. The body warmth of 4 men was enough to keep the temperature near 30 degrees Fahrenheit, but to create a steady supply of hot water, the fastest way to reverse hypothermia. The snow cave had transformed from a shelter into a field hospital. The Great Blizzard was a filter, and the results were undeniable. Sergeant Finch's official report to the NWMP was a technical document, but it read like a eulogy for one method and a birth announcement for another. Statistics: of the 85 men caught on the pass in ice block or canvas shelters, 21 died, and 45 suffered severe, life-altering frostbite. Of the 12 men who had copied Reed's snowdrift design, a number that had grown as others observed his comfort, all 12 survived, with 0 cases of frostbite. The data was absolute. Elias Thorne, his feet and hands swathed in bandages, became the design's most vocal convert. "We were fools," he was heard saying at the police barracks. "We were building with the cold. Reed was building with the air." The NWMP immediately adopted the design, striking ice block shelters from their manuals and replacing them with diagrams of the Reed-style sintered snow dome. Local Tagish and Tlingit guides, employed by the Mounties, merely nodded. It was, they noted, a cleverer, faster version of the snow lodges their own ancestors had used for centuries, a perfect fusion of indigenous knowledge and an engineer's mind. By the spring of 1898, the landscape of the Chilkoot Pass had transformed. The shores of the lakes were no longer scarred by the sawing of ice blocks. Instead, the hillsides were dotted with the gentle, organic mounds of snow caves, dug into the drifts. The Coyote Den had become the gold standard. Silas Reed never found his ton of gold. He spent that summer working as a guide, leading greener men over the pass, his fee often just a hot meal and a bag of tobacco. His legacy was not written in claims or nuggets, but in the living, breathing men who made it to Dawson City. The story of the Klondike is often told as a triumph of brute force, but the margin of survival was defined by a quiet, technical revolution. It was a lesson taught by the snow itself, that in the most extreme environments, survival is not a matter of fighting the elements, but of intelligently yielding to their laws. It is not about the thickness of the wall, but the understanding of the empty space within.